The lobby of the Delta County Human Services Building smelled like floor wax and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a flat institutional pallor that made even healthy skin look gray. A plastic fern sat in the corner near the door, its leaves coated in a fine layer of dust that nobody had bothered to wipe away in what looked like years. The clock on the wall read 9:14 on a Tuesday morning in late September, and Wren Caldwell was about to stop being a child in the eyes of the state of Colorado. She sat in a molded plastic chair with her knees together and her hands folded in her lap, the way she had learned to sit in waiting rooms across 4 counties and 6 foster placements over the past 12 years. Sit still. Take up less space. Don't give anyone a reason to notice you for the wrong reasons. She was good at it by now. 18 years of practice. Her caseworker, a tired woman named Deborah with reading glasses on a beaded chain, emerged from a side office carrying a thin manila envelope. She crossed the lobby with the careful measured steps of someone who had done this particular walk many times before, and each time wished she didn't have to. "Wren," Deborah said, and offered a smile that was meant to be warm but landed somewhere closer to sympathetic. "Happy birthday." It wasn't her birthday. Her birthday had been 11 days ago, spent eating a gas station cupcake on the back steps of her last group home in Montrose, while 2 younger kids argued about a phone charger inside. But today was the day the paperwork was finalized. Today was the day she aged out. Deborah handed her the envelope. Inside were her documents, a birth certificate listing a mother she had never met, and a father left blank, a social security card. A prepaid Visa debit card with a balance of $412, which represented the sum total of her financial existence. And beneath all of it, folded once and sealed in a separate white envelope, a notarized deed. This was processed through probate about 14 months ago. Deborah explained, lowering her voice slightly, as if delivering sensitive news, which she was. "Your maternal grandmother, Eleanor Caldwell, passed away and left the property to you. It's an orchard, or it was, outside Paonia in the North Fork Valley." Wren stared at the name on the deed. Eleanor Caldwell. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, though it had lived inside her head every single day, pressed into the soft tissue of memory like a thumbprint in wet clay. Eleanor, her grandmother, the woman who had raised her until she was 6 years old, and then, as far as Wren had understood, for 12 long and aching years, had simply let her go. "There's also this," Deborah said, handing her a business card clipped to a sticky note. "A gentleman from an agricultural company has been trying to reach you. He called our office twice last week. I told him he'd need to contact you directly after today." Wren took the card. "Titan Agro Ventures, Acquisitions Division, Ray Dawson, Senior Land Officer." She slipped it into the envelope without reading the phone number. Deborah extended her hand. Wren shook it. The handshake was brief and professional, the kind exchanged between 2 people who understood that this moment, however significant, was also routine. It happened every day across every state. Children became adults. Systems released them. The world expected them to figure out the rest.
"You have my number if you need anything,"
Deborah said. Wren nodded, slung her faded backpack over one shoulder, and walked out through the glass doors into a bright, wind-scoured Colorado morning. Outside, the air hit her face like a slap. Dry and thin, carrying the smell of sun-baked asphalt and exhaust from a delivery truck idling at the curb. The sky was enormous and blue and utterly indifferent. She stood on the cracked concrete steps and let the wind press against her, feeling two things simultaneously and with equal force: exposed and invisible. She was 18 years old. She was legally an adult. She was financially almost broke. And she owned a dead orchard she hadn't seen since she was 6. Her phone buzzed before noon. The man on the other end introduced himself as Ray Dawson. His voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. He spoke the way people do when persuasion is their profession: measured cadence, warm but controlled, almost friendly, but not quite, because genuine friendliness doesn't need to be performed. "Miss Caldwell, I understand you've just come into ownership of the property on Garnet Mesa Road," he said. "We've been monitoring that parcel for some time. I'll be straightforward with you. The land hasn't been operational in years. The trees are dead or dying. The infrastructure is shot. We're prepared to offer $8,000 for a clean transfer, which honestly is generous given the condition." $8,000. Wren leaned against the rusted railing outside the county building and let that number sit in her chest. $8,000. To someone whose entire net worth was a prepaid debit card and a backpack with a broken zipper. $8,000 was not just money. It was a different life. First and last month's rent on an apartment, a used car that ran, community college tuition for a semester, a foothold. The property taxes alone will eat you alive. Ray continued, his tone helpful and slightly conspiratorial, as if they were on the same side of a problem. "And the county's been eyeing that land for code violations. Honestly, Miss Caldwell, we'd be doing you a favor." Wren closed her eyes. She tried to picture the orchard. She tried to remember anything specific, any concrete detail she could hold on to. But all that came was a feeling. The faint, sweet, almost imaginary smell of apple blossoms. The warmth of rough, weathered hands lifting her onto someone's hip. A voice humming something low and tuneless. Sunlight through green leaves. And then the memory fractured the way memories do when they've been replayed too many times, and she was left standing on a sidewalk in Delta, Colorado, 18 years old, holding a phone to her ear and trying to decide the rest of her life before lunch. If Eleanor had loved her, why hadn't she fought to keep her? If Eleanor hadn't loved her, why leave her anything at all? "I'm not selling," Wren said. The words came out before she fully decided them, which was how she knew they were true. "Not until I see it." There was a pause on the other end. Brief, controlled, just long enough to feel calculated. "Of course," Ray said smoothly. "Take your time. But I should mention our offer won't stay on the table indefinitely. These things have a window." After the call ended, Wren stood still for a long moment, watching traffic crawl past on Main Street. Then she walked 3 blocks east to the Greyhound station and bought a one-way ticket to Paonia. $47. It left her balance at $365. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being placed somewhere. She wasn't being transferred, relocated, reassigned, or moved for someone else's convenience. She was choosing where to go. The sensation was strange and unsettling, like stepping off a moving sidewalk and realizing the ground beneath you has been still the whole time. The bus smelled like vinyl and hand sanitizer, and the particular kind of silence that gathers when strangers are determined not to interact. Wren took a window seat near the back and pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the landscape shift as the bus climbed west out of Delta and into the North Fork Valley. The terrain changed gradually. Flat, sun-beaten rangeland gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinon pine. Irrigation ditches ran alongside the road, some flowing thin and sluggish, others dry as bone. In the distance, the West Elk Mountains rose in a long, uneven line against the sky, their peaks already carrying the first dusting of early snow. Somewhere around the halfway mark, an old man boarded at a small roadside stop. He was tall and lean in the way that decades of outdoor work makes a person with deep-set eyes and sun-darkened skin and hands that looked like they had been shaped by tools. He wore a faded denim jacket and a cap from a feed company that probably didn't exist anymore. He settled into the seat across the aisle from Wren with the slow, deliberate movements of someone whose joints had opinions about every change in weather. They rode in silence for 20 minutes before the man spoke the way people in small western towns sometimes do, without preamble and without apparent expectation of a response. Heading to Paonia, Wren glanced over. Yeah. Visiting? Not exactly. I inherited some property out there. The man nodded slowly, looking out the window at the passing landscape as if consulting it. Lot of property changing hands these days. Valley's not what it was. It's an orchard, Wren said. Apple orchard on Garnet Mesa Road. Something shifted in the man's face. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a slight adjustment in the set of his jaw, the kind of change you'd miss entirely if you weren't already watching. He turned his head toward the window and was quiet for a long time. "That's so?" he said finally, and his voice had gone carefully flat. He didn't ask her name. He didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. When the bus pulled into Paonia, the man stood up, gave Wren a single unreadable nod, and stepped off into the afternoon sun without looking back. Paonia looked the way small western Colorado towns often do, stubborn, holding on. A feed store anchored one end of the main drag with a faded John Deere sign bolted above the door. A diner across the street advertised green chili burgers on a hand-painted board. Pickup trucks, mostly American-made and mostly old, angled along the curb like they'd been parked there since the Reagan administration. A hardware store, a thrift shop, a small brick post office with an American flag that had seen better days. Wren got directions from a cashier at the general store. A middle-aged woman who looked at her with the particular curiosity reserved for unfamiliar faces in towns where everyone knows everyone else's truck by sight. "The Caldwell place," the woman said, eyebrows rising slightly. "Out on Garnet Mesa, thought. Nobody owned that anymore." She paused, studying Wren with an expression that hovered between suspicion and pity. "You walking, if I have to." The woman pointed her toward a man loading feed bags into a flatbed who was headed in that direction. Wren climbed into the truck bed and rode the last 12 miles sitting on a bag of alfalfa pellets, watching the landscape open up around her. Brittle grassland, irrigation ditches running low, mesa tops flat and rust-colored against the sky. The air smelled like sage and dry earth and something faintly mineral like rock dust. The driver let her off where a dirt road branched south from the county highway. A battered mailbox stood at the junction, its door hanging open, the name Caldwell still barely visible in faded paint. Wren walked the last quarter mile alone. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful place, but the heavy pressing silence of somewhere that had been abandoned long enough for even the sounds of life to give up and move on. No hum of sprinklers, no birdsong in the branches, no rustle of healthy leaves, just wind pushing through dead wood with a hollow rattling sound, like dry bones knocking together. The farmhouse stood at the end of the drive, leaning slightly to the left as if it had grown tired of standing upright, and no one had been around to argue the point. White paint, or what had once been white paint, had surrendered years ago to sun and wind and the particular cruelty of high-altitude weather. The porch steps sagged in the middle. Two of the windows were cracked. A barn door hung crooked on one hinge, revealing a dark interior that smelled of old hay and rust. And beyond the house, stretching in uneven rows toward the mesa's edge, was the orchard, or what was left of it. Wren walked between the first two rows slowly, her boots crunching over hard-packed soil that hadn't seen water in what looked like years. The trees stood like monuments to something that had failed. Gnarled trunks twisted upward into brittle limbs, bark split and peeling from seasons of drought. Some had fallen entirely, lying across the rows like collapsed scaffolding. Others still stood but were clearly dead, their branches scratching against the sky like fingers reaching for something that wasn't there. She crouched down and pressed her palm against the ground. It was hot and hard and unyielding, the way soil gets when it has forgotten how to absorb anything at all. A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. $8,000 suddenly sounded generous. She walked deeper into what used to be the center row, trying to match memory to reality. She remembered being small enough that the grass brushed her knees. She remembered sunlight filtering through thick green canopy, dappled and warm. She remembered the feeling of being enclosed by something living, something that hummed with bees and rustled with wind and smelled so sweet it made her chest ache. She remembered feeling safe. Now the branches scraped against her flannel shirt like dry fingers. The ground was cracked. The air tasted like dust. "She left me this," Wren said aloud to no one. The anger that rose was sharp and familiar, the particular anger of someone who has been disappointed by the same person so many times that disappointment has become its own form of loyalty. "She left me a graveyard." Maybe Titan was right. Maybe the land wasn't viable. Maybe Eleanor had run out of money, out of time, out of whatever feeble attachment she might have once felt for the granddaughter. She'd surrendered to the state without, as far as Wren knew, a single protest. Inside the house, dust coated everything in a thin, patient layer. The kitchen sink was dry and stained. The refrigerator door hung open, revealing empty shelves and a faint smell of mildew. A calendar from 2 years ago still clung to the wall above the stove, stopped on a November that must have been close to Eleanor's last. Cabinets held old canning jars, a rusted can opener, and a stack of yellowed seed catalogs from agricultural suppliers that had probably gone out of business. Wren dropped her backpack on the kitchen floor and sat at the small wooden table. It wobbled under her weight. She looked around at the empty room and tried to imagine Eleanor here, alone. Winter storms rolling through the valley, rattling the windows, bills accumulating on the counter. The silence of an empty house pressing in from every direction. If she'd loved me, Wren thought, staring at the cracked linoleum. Why didn't she come back? That question had lived inside her for 12 years, growing harder and sharper with each passing birthday, each new foster placement, each time she'd had to pack a bag and learn a new set of house rules and pretend she didn't care about the family she was leaving, because she'd trained herself not to care about the family she was going to. The question had become a kind of armor. If Eleanor didn't love her, then Wren didn't need to grieve. If Eleanor was simply a bad person who made a selfish choice, then the pain was righteous, justified, clean. The alternative, that there was more to the story, that love could look like abandonment from the outside, was a thought she had never allowed herself to hold for more than a few seconds at a time. It was too dangerous. It meant the world was more complicated than she could bear. By nightfall, the temperature dropped with the ruthless speed of high desert altitude. The warmth of the day simply vanished, replaced by a cold that seeped in through the walls and the gaps under the doors and the cracks in the window frames. Wren found a sleeping bag in her pack and wrapped herself on the couch, which smelled like old fabric and dust, and something faintly sweet that she told herself she didn't recognize. She lit a small camping lantern and sat on the porch steps, staring out at the dead orchard under a wide, extravagant scatter of stars. The Milky Way arched overhead, vivid and close, the way it only appears in places far enough from city light for the sky to remember what it actually looks like. Coyotes called somewhere in the distance, their voices thin and haunting across the mesa. She pulled out her phone and looked at the missed call notification from Ray Dawson. Tomorrow morning, she told herself, she would call. She would take the money. She would leave this dry, broken place behind and start over somewhere that didn't hurt to look at. The wind moved through the orchard again, low and restless, like something refusing to stay buried. Wren woke before sunrise, stiff from the couch springs and half decided about selling. The desert morning was deceptively gentle. Pale gold light stretched across the orchard from the east, softening the dead branches, painting them in tones of amber and rose, almost making them look alive if you didn't look too carefully. For one brief, irrational moment, standing at the kitchen window with her arms wrapped around herself for warmth, she wondered if she had exaggerated the damage in her head. She hadn't. By 8, the sun was climbing and the heat would follow. Wren moved through the kitchen, opening cabinets more out of restlessness than purpose. She was killing time before making the call. That was what she told herself. She was just waiting for a reasonable hour to phone Ray Dawson and say the words and be done with it. She was near the sink, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, when her boot heel caught on something. A loose board. It shifted under her weight with a hollow metallic thud that didn't sound like wood settling on wood. It sounded like wood settling on iron. Wren froze. She crouched down slowly, running her fingers along the warped edge of the plank. It moved. Not much, but enough. She pried at it carefully, working her fingernails into the gap, and lifted the board away. Beneath it sat a narrow iron hatch, its surface dusty but intact. The handle set flush with the floor in a way that looked deliberate, intentional, hidden. Her pulse quickened. She felt it in her throat, in her wrists, in the tips of her fingers. She was cautious. She was skeptical. She was unwilling to hope because hope had never done her any favors, and she had stopped extending it credit a long time ago. She gripped the handle and pulled. It resisted, then gave with a dry, protesting groan, releasing a breath of cool air from below that smelled like earth and stone and something clean and preserved. A wooden ladder descended into dimness. Wren turned on her phone's flashlight and started down, testing each rung before committing her weight. The light cut a narrow beam through the dark, illuminating concrete walls, of floor shapes emerging from shadow. What she expected was a root cellar, jars of old preserves, maybe a forgotten wine rack, the kind of underground storage that old farmhouses sometimes have, practical and unremarkable. What she found made her stop halfway down the ladder, one hand gripping the rung above her head, her phone casting a shaking circle of light across the room below. It wasn't storage. Shelving units lined 3 walls floor to ceiling, and on every shelf sat rows of labeled glass jars filled with seeds, not random collections scooped from the garden. These were carefully catalogued batches, each jar marked with dates, strain names, cross-pollination records, and trial numbers in precise slanted handwriting. Drought Trial 7 Garnet Mesa, Cross Batch 14, Late Bloom Variant. Arid Soil Adaptation, 3rd Generation. Humidity meters hung at intervals along the walls. Sealed plastic containers held labeled soil samples from what appeared to be dozens of different test locations. Binders, thick and well organized, were stacked on a long metal table that ran down the center of the room, their spines labeled by year. The earliest was dated 3 years after Wren entered foster care. The most recent was from roughly 2 years ago. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't someone tinkering. This was research. Systematic, methodical, years-long research, conducted in secret underground by a woman the world had apparently forgotten. Wren stepped fully onto the concrete floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved along the shelves, slowly reading labels, touching jar lids with her fingertips, as if she might absorb their meaning through her skin. The scope of it was staggering. Eleanor had spent years, possibly the entire 12 years Wren was in the system, crossbreeding apple varietals for drought resistance. She had tested them against soil conditions across western Colorado. She had documented failures and partial successes and incremental gains with the patience of someone who understood that the work might outlast her. At the far end of the metal table, partially hidden behind a stack of binders, sat a small cedar box. The wood was smooth and dark, the grain tight and fine, and carved into the lid in careful, deliberate letters was a name: Wren Caldwell. She stood there for a long time, staring at her own name on that box, feeling something shift inside her chest that she couldn't name and wasn't sure she wanted to. Then she reached out with both hands and opened it. Inside lay a thick notebook, its cover worn soft from handling, and a single letter folded once and sealed with a piece of tape that had yellowed with age. Wren unfolded the letter first. The handwriting was unmistakable. Strong, slightly slanted to the right, with a particular way of crossing the letter T that she recognized from birthday cards she had received during the first 2 years of foster care, and then stopped receiving without explanation. The letter began simply: "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain." Wren's jaw tightened. She read slowly, her eyes moving across each line with the careful, guarded attention of someone reading a document that might be a trap. The letter spoke of medical bills, a diagnosis that came without warning, and with a price tag that consumed everything. Treatments that insurance didn't cover, a savings account emptied in 8 months, a second mortgage that couldn't be sustained, and then a meeting with a family court judge who looked at the numbers and the prognosis and the age of a 6-year-old girl and advised with professional detachment that the child would have better health care, better schooling, and better prospects in state custody than with an aging insolvent guardian whose ability to provide long-term care was, the judge's word, uncertain. Eleanor wrote about signing papers in a courthouse hallway, about the sound the pen made against the clipboard, about walking to her truck afterward and sitting in the parking lot for 2 hours because she couldn't see well enough through her tears to drive. Wren stopped reading. "No," she said. The word came out hard and flat, a reflex, a shield going up. "If she loved me, she would have fought." She dropped the letter onto the metal table. It landed face up, the handwriting staring back at her, patient and unanswerable. The anger came fast and hot the way it always did when anything threatened the story she had built to survive on. The story was simple. Eleanor gave her up because Eleanor didn't care enough to keep her. The story was clean. The story protected her from something worse. She couldn't afford to let the story be wrong. She grabbed the notebook instead, flipping it open roughly, looking for something to contradict the letter. Some proof that this was a performance, a guilt-driven fantasy, a dead woman trying to rewrite history. The notebook was organized chronologically. Page after page documented crop failures across western Colorado, notes on increasing aridity, declining water tables, soil degradation from years of unsustainable farming practices. Detailed observations about corporate consolidation, about small family farms being bought out one by one, about how companies like Titan approached struggling landowners with offers carefully calibrated to seem generous, while the land was distressed, and to seem urgent before the owners realized what their property might actually be worth. There were entries about Titan approaching Eleanor specifically, multiple times. The offers increased over the years, but were always tied to the same condition: full transfer, no retained rights, no licensing claims, no future stake. They didn't just want the land, the notebook made clear. They had somehow learned about the research. They wanted the seeds. Toward the back of the notebook, the entry shifted. The technical observations gave way to something more personal, more raw, written in a hand that pressed harder into the paper. I won't let them take this, not until it's ready, not until you're ready. There were details scattered through these later pages that no outsider could fabricate. The time Wren had broken her arm falling from the porch railing, and Eleanor had driven 30 miles to the hospital with Wren in her lap because the truck's passenger door was jammed shut. The stuffed coyote Wren had refused to sleep without the one with the chewed ear and the button eye that was always coming loose. The way Wren used to stand on a wooden crate in the orchard and pick apples directly from the low branches and insist with the absolute conviction of a 5-year-old that they tasted better straight off the tree than from any store. Tears blurred the ink. Wren wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, angry at herself for crying, angrier at Eleanor for making her cry, angriest of all at the 12 years of silence that no letter, however loving, could fully explain. She picked the letter back up and finished it, hands trembling now for a different reason. I stayed away so you could have a future. I built this so you could choose one. Everything in this room is yours. The seeds, the research, the years of work. It belongs to you, Wren, not to Titan, not to anyone else. If it's worth something, let it be worth something on your terms. And if you decide it's not worth anything at all, that's your right too. I just wanted you to have the choice I never did. The letter was signed simply, your grandmother, Eleanor. Wren sank onto the metal stool beside the table. The weight of 12 years of resentment settled onto her shoulders like something physical pressing down with a gravity she hadn't realized she'd been carrying until this moment, when the scaffolding beneath it began to give way. She had carried the story of being unwanted like armor. She had worn it every day in every foster home, in every school hallway, in every room, where she felt like a guest who had overstayed. The story had kept her moving. It had kept her hard. It had kept her alive in the particular way that hardness keeps people alive, by making sure nothing gets close enough to wound. Now that armor was cracking, and underneath it she wasn't sure what was left. She sat in that underground room until the light from above shifted from gold to white to the long warm amber of late afternoon. The house above was silent. The orchard outside still looked dead. But down here beneath the rot and dust and years of neglect, something had been alive the whole time, working, growing, waiting for someone to come and find it. Wren didn't call Titan that morning. She didn't call them that afternoon. She climbed out of the cellar as the sun was setting, sat on the porch steps with the letter pressed against her chest, and watched the dead orchard darken under a sky that turned from copper to violet to black. The stars came out again, vast and silent. The wind moved through the brittle branches with that same hollow, restless sound. But it didn't sound like emptiness anymore. It sounded like patience. The law office of Harold Kinsey occupied a small brick building on Grand Avenue, wedged between a barber shop that still had a spinning pole and a vacant storefront with brown paper taped over its windows. The building looked like it had been built in the 1950s and hadn't been significantly updated since, which in a town like Pioneer was less a sign of neglect than of permanence. Things that lasted here didn't need to be new, they just needed to hold. Wren pushed through the glass door the following morning, Eleanor's notebook tucked under one arm and the letter folded carefully in the back pocket of her jeans. A bell chimed overhead. The reception area was small and neat, with wood-paneled walls, a worn leather chair, and a framed photograph of the North Fork Valley, taken from somewhere high, the kind of photograph that made the landscape look both beautiful and impossibly large. Harold Kinsey emerged from his office within a minute, as if he'd been expecting someone, though he clearly hadn't been expecting her. He was late 60s, maybe older, tall and slightly stooped in the way that men of considerable height sometimes become when they spend decades leaning down to listen to people. Silver hair combed neatly back from a broad forehead, wire-rimmed glasses perched low on a long, deliberate nose. His handshake was firm but cautious, the handshake of a man who had learned the cost of misjudging things and had decided somewhere along the way that caution was cheaper than regret. "I'm Wren Caldwell," she said. "Eleanor Caldwell was my grandmother." Something moved behind Harold's eyes. Not surprise exactly, something closer to recognition. The kind of look a person gets when a chapter they thought was closed turns out to have one more page. "I know who Eleanor was," he said quietly. "Come in." His office was small, lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets, and it smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long on the warmer. A single window looked out onto the street where a man in a cowboy hat was loading fence posts into a truck with the unhurried ease of someone who had nowhere else to be. Wren laid the notebook and the letter on the desk. Harold sat down, put on his reading glasses, and began. He read the way lawyers read, slowly with the pencil in his hand, occasionally making small marks in the margin of a yellow legal pad. The office clock ticked loudly in the silence between them. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Wren sat still and watched his face change. It started with polite curiosity, the professional attentiveness of a small-town attorney being presented with an unusual case. Then his brow furrowed. His pencil moved faster. He flipped back through pages he'd already read, cross-referencing dates and notations. By the time he reached the later entries, the personal ones, his expression had shifted to something sharper and more focused. The look of a man who has just realized he is holding something considerably more significant than he initially assumed. When he finally looked up, he removed his glasses and set them on the desk with a deliberate precision that suggested he was choosing his next words carefully. "I worked with your grandmother," Harold said. "She came to me about 6 years ago when Titan first started applying real pressure. She wanted to understand her legal options. He paused. She was determined. That's the word I'd use. Most people in her position would have taken the money. She wouldn't. What happened? Harold leaned back in his chair. It creaked under him. I told her the fight wasn't worth it. I told her she was one person against a corporation with more lawyers than she had apple trees. I told her to take their offer, invest the money, and spend her remaining years in peace. He met Wren's eyes. I was wrong. The word landed in the room with a weight that surprised them both. If this research holds up, Harold continued tapping the notebook with his index finger. And based on what I'm reading, it very well might then. Titan didn't just want your land, Wren. They wanted this, the seeds, the data, the drought-resistant varietal your grandmother spent over a decade developing. Land in the North Fork Valley is worth something, sure. But proprietary agricultural research with applications across the entire arid West. He shook his head slowly. That's worth considerably more than $8,000. They filed the preliminary paperwork that afternoon. A provisional intellectual property claim on Eleanor's seed research, submitted to the county clerk's office with copies sent to the state patent office in Denver. Harold explained that the process would take time, that the claim would need to be validated by independent experts, and that Titan would almost certainly challenge it. But the filing itself established a legal foothold. It put Wren's name on the research. It drew a line. The line was crossed within 48 hours. 2 days after the filing, Wren drove her borrowed truck out to the orchard at dawn and found the irrigation lines sliced clean through in 3 separate places, not cracked from age or frost, cut. The edges were sharp and deliberate, the kind of cuts made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted the damage to be unmistakable without leaving any evidence of who had done it. No footprints, no tire track. The ground around the cuts had been swept clean, probably with a branch. Wren stood in the morning cold, staring at the severed plastic tubing she had just paid a plumber in Hotchkiss $240 to repair, and felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. It was the particular sensation of realizing that the game you thought you were playing has different rules than you assumed. That same week, the county clerk's office informed Harold that the patent filing had been misrouted. The paperwork, which had been hand-delivered and signed for, had somehow ended up in a different department entirely, one that processed land use permits rather than intellectual property claims. The delay, they said, would be at least 3 weeks. Harold made calls. The calls were not returned. A local blog, the kind that covered school board meetings and high school football, and occasionally ran opinion pieces about county politics, published a speculative article questioning whether a teenager who had just aged out of foster care could legitimately claim ownership of proprietary agricultural research. The article didn't name Wren directly, but it didn't need to. In a town the size of Paonia, implication was as effective as identification. The piece quoted an unnamed agricultural industry source who expressed concern about unvetted claims, creating legal uncertainty for established operations in the valley. At the feed store, conversations quieted when Wren walked in, not silenced, just quieted, adjusted. The way sound changes in a room when the subject of the conversation enters it. She felt the shift like a change in air pressure, glances that lasted a beat too long, smiles that didn't reach the eyes. The polite measured distance that people maintain when they want you to know you're being watched without saying so directly. It was subtle. It was calculated. It was designed not to intimidate but to isolate. Not loud threats or obvious confrontation, just enough friction applied to enough surfaces to wear a person down. The black SUV came on a Friday afternoon. Ren was on the porch reviewing soil samples from the cellar and trying to match Eleanor's notes to the layout of the orchard when the vehicle rolled up the gravel driveway and stopped in a cloud of pale dust. Ray Dawson stepped out. He was younger than she'd expected from his voice, early 30s, with a clean jaw and carefully maintained stubble and sunglasses that reflected the brittle orchard behind him like a pair of small dark mirrors. He wore a sport coat over a dress shirt with no tie, the uniform of corporate casual, in a setting where corporate anything felt like a foreign language. "Miss Caldwell," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it from the phone. Smooth, measured, the voice of a man who had been trained to make pressure sound like concern. "I see you've been busy." Ren stood up from the porch step. She didn't invite him closer. "What do you want?" "The same thing I wanted before. A fair deal for a property that's costing you more than it's worth." He gestured at the orchard, the dead trees, the leaning barn. "You're in over your head. That's not an insult, it's an observation. Litigation is expensive. Research validation is expensive. You're 18 years old and you're picking a fight with a company that has a legal department bigger than this town." He said it the way someone delivers a weather forecast, factual, neutral, almost sympathetic. "We're still offering stability," Ray continued. "Financial security, a clean start. Walk away now and you walk away with money in your pocket and no enemies." "Stability for who?" Ren asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands tucked into her back pockets so he wouldn't see them were shaking. Ray tilted his head slightly, as if the question was unexpected and mildly interesting. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that acknowledges a point without conceding it, and got back into the SUV without another word. The dust from his tires took a long time to settle. Later that afternoon, Harold called and asked her to come into town. When she arrived, his office door was closed, which it hadn't been either of the previous times she'd visited. He opened it himself and shut it behind her. "They approached me," Harold said. He was standing behind his desk rather than sitting, which made him look taller and somehow more exposed, like a man bracing for an impact. "A representative from Titan, not Dawson, someone else, more senior. He suggested that my involvement in your case might attract," he used the word unwelcome, so "attention to certain aspects of my professional history." Ren's stomach tightened. "What aspects?" Harold was quiet for a moment. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose in a gesture that looked like it had been practiced over decades of difficult conversations. 20 years ago, I made an error in a property transaction, a boundary dispute. It was resolved, the client was compensated, and the Bar Association reviewed and cleared me. But the record exists, and records in the right hands can be made to look like more than they were. He set his glasses back on. "They're not threatening me with anything real. They're threatening me with the appearance of something real, which in a small town is often enough." Ren looked at him. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands, the particular weariness of a man being asked to choose between safety and conviction. She understood that choice. She had been making it her entire life. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I can find another lawyer."
Someone in Grand Junction, maybe. Someone they don't have leverage over. Harold met her eyes. Something in his expression hardened, not with anger, but with the particular kind of resolve that comes when a person has been offered an exit and realize they don't want to take it. I told your grandmother to sell, he said, 6 years ago in this office at this desk. I told her the fight wasn't worth it. I told her to be practical. She looked at me the way you're looking at me right now, and she walked out and she went home and she fought alone for 6 more years until she died. I could have stood with her. I didn't. He paused. I was wrong then. I won't be wrong again.
The weight in the room shifted. This wasn't just a legal case anymore. It wasn't just Wren against a corporation. It was something older and heavier, a reckoning that stretched back years, pulling in debts that had never been settled and choices that had never been fully faced. Gil Harmon appeared at the orchard the following morning. He came without announcement, driving a battered Ford pickup loaded with fencing tools, PVC pipe, a post-hole digger, and two 5-gallon buckets of something that smelled powerfully organic. Wren watched from the porch as he parked near the barn, climbed out with the slow deliberateness she remembered from the bus, and began unloading. "What are you doing?" she called. "Fixing your fence line," Gil said without looking up. "East side's down in 3 places. Cattle from the Henderson Ranch are going to come through before the month's out if it's not patched. I didn't ask you to fix my fence. No, you didn't." He kept working. Wren watched for several minutes, caught between the instinct to refuse help, which had been her default setting for as long as she could remember, and the pragmatic recognition that her fence was in fact down in 3 places, and she had no idea how to fix it. She walked down to where Gil was digging and stood with her arms crossed. "You know who I am," she said. "You knew on the bus." Gil drove the post-hole digger into the ground with a force that belied his age. He didn't answer immediately. He finished the hole, set the digger aside, and straightened up with a slow exhalation that had the sound of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was about to set it down. "I knew your grandmother for 31 years, he said. He looked at Wren directly for the first time, and his eyes, deep-set and weathered, held a sorrow that was specific and personal and old. "We were neighbors, friends. I watched her raise you for those first 6 years, and I watched her fall apart when they took you away." "Then where were you?" Wren said. The question came out harder than she intended, but she didn't soften it. Gil absorbed the words without flinching. He nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting them and had agreed long before she asked that he deserved them. "I was scared," he said. "Titan came after Eleanor hard. They leaned on suppliers, on water rights, on anyone connected to her. I had my own place. 40 acres, 3 generations. They made it clear, not with words, never with words, that association with Eleanor Caldwell carried a cost." He looked down at his hands, still gripping the wooden handle of the digger. "So I stayed away. I told myself it wasn't my fight. I told myself she'd sell eventually and it would all blow over." He paused. The wind picked up across the mesa, carrying the smell of dust and sage. "She didn't sell. She went down into that cellar every night after supper and worked until midnight. She tested soil and labeled seeds and kept records like a woman building a cathedral nobody else could see. And I sat on my porch 1.5 miles away and watched her lights go out and told myself I was being practical." His voice cracked on the last word. He cleared his throat roughly. and drove the digger into the ground again. She died a lone wren 2 winters ago. They found her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. I was the one they called because I was listed as her emergency contact, which was a kindness I didn't deserve because I hadn't earned it in years. Wren stood still, the wind pressing against her, and felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. The particular understanding that comes from recognizing that the people who fail us are usually not monsters. They are usually just afraid. Gil stayed. He came back the next morning, the morning after that. He taught Wren how to read soil moisture by feel pressing a handful into a ball and watching how it crumbled. He showed her how to check irrigation pressure, how to clean sediment from drip lines, how to identify which trees were truly dead and which still carried the faintest thread of life in their root systems. He worked beside her without talking much, the way men of his generation often work, communicating through shared labor rather than conversation, letting the doing say what the words couldn't. One evening, Wren confronted the thing she'd been circling around for days. Ray Dawson. She had looked him up after his visit. County records, old newspaper mentions, business filings. What she found wasn't what she expected. Raymond Dawson had grown up in the North Fork Valley. His father, Curtis Dawson, had owned a 60-acre stone fruit orchard on Rogers Mesa, peaches and cherries, mostly a family operation going back 2 generations. When Ray was 15, Titan acquired a controlling interest in the valley's primary water cooperative and began renegotiating terms that made small-scale farming economically unviable for anyone who didn't sell. Curtis Dawson held out for 2 years. Then the water fees tripled. Then the equipment loans were called in. The orchard was sold at auction. Curtis never recovered. The family scattered. Ray had gone to college on a scholarship, studied agricultural business, and come back to the valley wearing a sport coat and working for the company that had destroyed his family's livelihood. Wren sat with this information for a long time, turning it over the way she turned soil samples in her hands, trying to understand its composition. Ray wasn't just a corporate operative doing a job. He was a man who had watched his father lose everything and decided that the only way to survive was to join the force that had taken it. He hated people like Wren, not because she was an obstacle. He hated her because she was doing the thing he hadn't had the courage to do. She was fighting. It didn't make him sympathetic exactly, but it made him human. And human opponents were harder to hate cleanly than faceless ones. Colleen Brewer arrived in Paonia 3 weeks after the patent filing, finally cleared its bureaucratic detour, and reached the state office. She was a plant geneticist from Colorado State University in Fort Collins, early 30s, with sun-bleached hair pulled back in a practical braid, and the kind of direct, no-nonsense manner that comes from spending more time in greenhouses than conference rooms. She had come across the filing through a colleague and driven 5 hours to see the research firsthand. Wren led her down into the cellar. Colleen moved along the shelves, the way Harold had read the notebook slowly at first. Then with increasing intensity, pulling jars, reading labels, cross-referencing Eleanor's notes with the practiced eye that could parse the data far more fluently than Wren could. After 2 hours, Colleen climbed back up the ladder, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at Wren with an expression that mixed professional excitement with something approaching reverence. "Do you understand what your grandmother did?" Colleen asked. "She bred apple trees." She bred apple trees that can survive on 40% less water than any commercial varietal currently in production. Over 12 years working alone without institutional funding or peer support or access to a lab, she developed a drought-resistant strain through systematic crossbreeding and field testing that is, as far as I can determine from these records, entirely unique. Colleen paused. There are research teams at 3 major universities working on this exact problem with millions of dollars in grants. Your grandmother did it in a cellar with mason jars and a notebook. The weight of that settled over Wren like something physical. She looked at the cellar hatch still open in the kitchen floor and tried to picture Eleanor descending that ladder night after night alone, sick, aging the world above her, drying up and the people around her turning away and still working, still believing the work mattered, still believing that someday someone would come and find it. The following days moved fast. Colleen began running prelims.